Hi, I'm Deshaun Drew, the president of Minnesota Public Radio. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Spotlight on the Future of Policing. When George Floyd was killed at the hands of Minneapolis police in late May, our community became the epicenter of a global movement to address racism in its most obvious and lethal forms, as well as in its more subtle, yet soul-killing forms. Floyd's killing sparked an extremely painful time in and beyond the Twin Cities. It also presented a powerful opportunity for us to take an honest look and sustained look at how our society was built and how it operates today. Minnesota Public Radio is committed to exploring and illuminating the disparities that prevent Minnesota from being its best self. We are committed to increasing our coverage of complex issues that can help our region build understanding and deepen connections. As James Baldwin wrote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. NPR is committed to being part of that change. We will continue to hold these spotlight events in the months ahead and cover a range of topics from education and healthcare to economic opportunities and beyond. I would be remiss if I didn't note that today is the 26th anniversary of the fatal shooting of two St. Paul police officers, Ron Ryan Jr. and Tim Jones. Their service and sacrifice is a reminder of the very real dangers that police officers face in patrolling our communities. Hosting today's event is Brandt Williams, a reporter for NPR News based in Minneapolis. In recent months, Brandt's reporting has focused on efforts to defund the Minneapolis Police Department and how Minneapolis residents are reacting to the debate. He has also reported on a lawsuit by Minneapolis residents to maintain the city's police force and on the role of police unions in reform. Over to you, Brandt.
Thanks, Deshaun. This is NPR News. I'm Brandt Williams, and welcome to a special program on the future of policing. You know, we planned this conversation more than a month ago as part of our continuing coverage of the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. But once again, the actions of a police officer have brought more urgency to this discussion. And just this past Sunday, a police officer in Kenosha, Wisconsin, shot and seriously wounded a Black man named Jacob Blake in the back from close range. Again, people have taken to the streets to demand justice and for an end to police brutality. Now, for some, that means an end to policing as we know it. And others have called for reforms meant to change police culture, to hold officers accountable, and to restore trust between the police and particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But either way, there appears to be a nationwide consensus that the current system needs to change. But we're asking, what does that change look like? What's the best way for cities to provide public safety for their residents without exacerbating racial disparities? What is the role, or what role should police departments and police officers play in our communities? So that's where we're going to start our conversation today. Now, before I introduce my guests, I want to invite viewers participating in the video conference that you can add your questions to the Q&A function, the little chat window down there at the bottom of the screen. And we're going to try to get as many questions as we can to our panelists. And we've also heard from some people who have submitted questions through voicemail, and we're going to try to get to some of those as well. Now, I'm happy to introduce our panelists. They are three people with three distinct perspectives and experiences. First, Booker Hodges is the Assistant Commissioner for Law Enforcement at the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. Hodges has served in many different roles during his law enforcement career, including the interim police chief of the Prior Lake Police Department. And he's also served as president of the Minneapolis chapter of the NAACP. Booker, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you to NPR and for everybody listening and watching. I would encourage you to support NPR. Public supported community radio is very important. I support NPR, and I would encourage people to do so financially. So thanks for having me.
Oh, appreciate that, Booker. Also, Jonathan Judd is with us. He's the mayor of Moorhead. Before he became the city's first Black mayor in 2018, Judd served as a county prosecutor and also as a public defender. Jonathan Judd is also the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Minnesota State Community and Technical College in Moorhead. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brandt, for the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Great. And our last panelist is Erin May Quaid. She's a former DFL representative from Apple Valley. She's also an activist and the advocacy director at Gender Justice, which is a nonprofit focused on the issues of and consequences of gender inequality. Erin, thank you so much for being here. I know it was a last minute thing, so we really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. Well, before we dive right into this conversation, I'm going to borrow a question that my colleague Angela Davis tends to ask her guests these days. And it's basically, how's everybody doing? I mean, there's so many things going on right now, and life is pretty chaotic for just about all of us. So before we get into our discussion, I just want to do a quick check-in. And, Booker, let me start with you. How are you doing?
As good as can be. I'm not gonna lie, it's not the best of times in society, but personally, I got a wife, 2 kids that love me very much, so I can't complain too much. So, but I wish we'll get through this.
Right. Mayor, what about you?
I would say the same as Assistant Commissioner Hodges. I've got a wife, 3 kids. I can't necessarily say that it's really been easy to sleep comfortably with all the things that are going on, especially when you're trying to hold your community, your city, and your region together to get through the pandemic, the strife that we have going on in our society. But I've got a really great team of support, so I'm really blessed to have that. So we're going to be okay.
Thanks for the check-in. Erin, what about you? How are you doing?
Similarly, it's hard, right? This is all hard. This is also a long game, but I think that there is a particular kind of trauma when you see people who look like you, who look like your family, who look like your community, have violence enacted from the state over and over again. That said, I want to particularly say, Mayor Judd and Assistant Commissioner Hodges, like being leaders and being Black leaders right now, I can't imagine that burden. And so I really appreciate being in the space with you, because I know that is a unique and particular kind of load you're carrying.
Thanks. Well, let's jump right into the discussion. And I think it'd be hard to start without referring to what's been going on in Minneapolis, particularly the actions of the Minneapolis City Council. Earlier this year, they pushed for a ballot proposal which would allow Minneapolis residents to decide if the MPD should be replaced with a community safety and violence prevention department. The proposal allowed for the inclusion of licensed peace officers in that department, but the Charter Commission, of course, delayed their decision on that, which meant that voters will not be voting on it this year. And, I just recall covering these Charter Commission meetings, listening to the discussions. There was a lot of concern expressed by commission members and a few people who participated in public hearings that they were confused or concerned about what would happen if there was no or drastically reduced police force in Minneapolis. But there are supporters who countered, kept saying, look, we should be talking about what is being added to the city, not what is being taken away. And so I want to start our conversation with, when we talk about the future of policing, is there has a discussion leaned too far one way or another about what that entails? Erin, let me just start with you. I mean, I know you're concerned about policing issues. Should we be paying more attention to what can be added to society that will perhaps make it not necessary to have as many police officers patrolling our cities?
Absolutely. I think so often when we talk about changes, and in particular changes to systems that we've not experienced or had before, it can be really scary. And there is always an element of fear, right? Black people are often scapegoated or painted as criminals and scary. And so I think that is a layer that exists here as well. But we, humans built these systems, which means that we are uniquely qualified to rebuild them to do what we want them to do. And I think oftentimes when we get into conversations about policing, it can be, well, we're going to defund police or we're going to remove police and nothing else will change. So everything will stay the same, except there will be no law enforcement on the streets. And that's just not the world that folks are trying to create and are trying to move into. And so I think there are more of a focus on what does community safety really look like? How do we invest in those things? And what do we need? Those are better conversations to have.
Sure. And Mayor Judd, as a leader of a city, what does that look like in a city like yours? Is there, what can be added to enhance public safety that doesn't require adding more police officers?
Good question. I do agree with Representative Quaid that, you know, I think we need to look at how to transform policing. I think, you know, and I'll say, you know, right up front, I am against any defunding of the police. And that's just my personal stance on that. What I do believe needs to happen, however, is do we need the reform? What does that look like? Because obviously, in greater Minnesota, our narrative, though similar in some ways, is really distinct in other ways. I mean, as far as our policing, what that looks like, we at least in the Moorhead and the Clay County jurisdiction, take a really holistic approach of what community policing looks like. It's more than just walking through communities and building relationships while you're in uniform. We have our peace officers, whether it's Clay County or the jurisdictions within Clay County or the city of Moorhead, we have police officers who are actively engaged in their communities. Whether it's off duty, they're coaching youth sports teams. They're active in their churches. They're members of volunteer organizations. They live in their communities. So, I mean, and there's many other examples that I can provide, but I think from a holistic approach, getting officers to show their human side beyond the badge, and also internally looking at policies, procedures, and practices that look like they're building and putting into action, building more welcoming and inclusive environments for officers that come from diverse backgrounds, are able to come in, be successful, and permeate that inclusive culture. That's
Right.
what I think needs to happen.
Well, and I do want to I think this discussion, we're going to move into talking more about reforms as well. And I think those are some areas that I want to delve into a little deeper as well. And let me just move on to Booker as far as, you know, this question about, do you need armed police officers to perform every function? And again, when we talk about defunding, I think there are people who are trying to say we can use those same resources for other things that would free up officers to take care of the real, perhaps just the real serious law enforcement, violent criminal involved activities, and leave other things up to other city employees. Where do you stand on that?
So for me, and again, yeah, I'm going to put on my PhD hat here. I adamantly do not support defunding the police. I think people don't understand kind of what's happened over the years is the systems around law enforcement have been defunded. So I'll give you an example, and I'm just going to, in broad terms here. A city or a local county may say, you know, we're going to get rid of 10 social workers, but we'll give the sheriff 2 deputies, right? And the sheriff who, and his department may be short-staffed, they're like, okay, I'll take these 2 deputies, not realizing the extra responsibilities and duties that come along with that. And I think over the years, we've done this multiple times, and we've really lessened our social service support structures, and we've turned those functions over to law enforcement. And law enforcement, again, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've been the president of NAACP. I've been a community activist. Law enforcement is not set up to deal with a lot of the issues that we deal with for social, and, you know, in terms of social services. So what I think we need to do is really start to adequately fund the social support systems that are around law enforcement and start to remove some things like responding to mental health calls, nonviolent mental health calls from law enforcement. Because I think people have to realize that when you call the police, we show up. When we show up, we bring the tail of the criminal justice system with us wherever we go. It's just the nature of how the law is set up. And we have to really think about what situations do we really want to bring the tail of the criminal justice system with. If my, we get a lot of calls in some areas, my kid doesn't want to go to school, right? You call the cops for that. Is that an area where we want to bring the tail of the criminal justice system into? Or,
right. And let me, I want to include a comment. I received an email from a person who identified themselves as a St. Paul police officer, asked me not to use their name because they're not necessarily organized or authorized to speak to the media without permission. But this officer told me along those same lines that they feel like there should be adequate funding for these things that are supposed to handle these areas that that people want to see addressed. They want to see people get help who are experiencing mental health crises. And this officer said that they don't want to set up like this zero-sum game that either you put money towards these things or you fund police. Why can't there be a both-and approach to that? And I'm curious about anyone else here who wants to address that, this idea that perhaps we should be looking at making the pot, the resources larger for the people, for the types of services that we need, and not just pitting police against social services. Do you get what I'm saying, Representative Quaid?
Yeah, I do. And I think sometimes, especially when we're having conversations about the police system, right, it can be really easy to move into talking about police officers, right? But we're actually talking about a system. And does this system serve us? Is it doing what we need? And the answer is just fundamentally no. And then when we talk about what else can be there instead, we're actually still talking about a world in which people are still experiencing mental health crises and not having health insurance and health care, and it's tied to their job. We're still talking about a world where big pharma can, funnel opioids into our communities or through doctors into our bodies, and we're not actually taking the time to say, what are the root causes and how do we go back and stop doing that? And so I actually feel like so often we can be at the end of a conversation, who responds to X, Y, and Z situation, and we don't often take a step back to say, why is someone experiencing this, and what can we do to make sure that people do not experience mental health crises in the street or are homeless or what have you. And so I think that is so much more of the conversation we should be having, because when we start talking about who responds to crisis calls, we're just assuming that we change very few other things and that people just still experience crisis on a massive level, and we're just changing who shows up. And I don't want people to experience crisis anymore. We have to get to root causes.
Right. And I think this is something else that has been brought up over the years when I've done reporting on police and how they're trained to respond to certain situations. And Booker, you can respond to this too. Having that experience is wearing a badge and patrolling, that most of law enforcement work, police officers, most of their work does not involve them arresting people and showing up and having to use force. That's a rare occurrence. So again, coming back to the idea of defunding or at least reorganizing public safety in cities, in municipalities, does it make sense to delineate these types of services in ways that don't involve, again, an armed police officer to come and deal with a situation where somebody else who is more specialized, better trained to handle these types of situations?
I'll agree with that, and I'll go back to what I said earlier. I think that people have to understand that when you call law enforcement, we bring in the tail of the criminal justice system with us. And the question for society needs to be is, do we want to bring the criminal justice system into these different avenues? And I think that is a societal question that really needs to be asked. And again, you think about a lot of these instances that people talk about, people are calling the police. It's not the police are showing up. People are calling the police. And when they do that, again, I think we have to realize that they're bringing the tail of the criminal justice system with us whenever we go anywhere.
Right. And we've been getting some responses as well too. I'm sorry, go ahead, Erin. Yeah, jump in.
Oh, I was going to say too that because of the disinvestment in communities all over the nation, oftentimes police is the only system that exists within a community and the only system they have to rely on. And I think it's important to note that, because like Assistant Commissioner Hodges said, right, people call the police. So often that's the only service that exists within their neighborhood for them to rely on. And that is also part of the problem.
I want to get to a question that we received from somebody who's been viewing on Zoom. And this is a question from Joel, who asks, how damaging is the term defund the police? He asks, is there a better, more accurate term that could be used? It seems to be confusing. Aaron, back to you. I mean, I'm just curious about when we talk about what we're looking for, are we using is defund the police the best term, or is there something else maybe we could be putting out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note, I'm not a Minneapolitan. I live in the city of Apple Valley, and you know, folks in Minneapolis have made specific calls. And I think for people across the state, what we should be really focusing on is making sure communities are able to drive what public safety looks like in those communities. It's going to look different where Mayor Judd is at. It's going to look different in Apple Valley. It's going to look different in the city of Minneapolis. But we know that police don't need to be the first responders for everything. And we also know that we often use them as a stopgap for all the things we refuse to fund in the first place. And so I think, you know, I'm not going to get into a messaging war. People who have called for defunding the police in their cities mean defund. And what they often mean on the, you know, finishing the sentence is, and reinvest in the other things you stopped investing in. And so it's not get rid of a system and change nothing else. It's take that money and invest it in the things that we actually need in our community. And as a suburban person, you know, the taxpayers of Minneapolis, that money leaves their city because most of the police officers live in communities like mine. And so they pay our property taxes here and they fund our schools here. So that is money that's leaving the city of Minneapolis. And so sometimes when they say defund, they say invest in our community because we're already paying for that money to leave our city and go to somebody else's community.
I want to move on to the conversation to reforming. Again, we've asked people to call in and also leave some voicemail comments as well. And so I want to start getting to a few of those. We have a cut that we've received, a piece of tape from, her name is Linda. She's in Minneapolis. Linda in Minneapolis is concerned about the number of reform efforts over the years. So I think we can listen in to what Linda had to say about that.
Hi, my name is Linda and I live in Minneapolis. My question is, if you don't support defunding the police, what initiatives or proposals would you have instead to create true police accountability, given how many failed reform efforts we've had in our state throughout the years? Thank you.
That was from Linda. Mayor Judd, as somebody, you say you don't support defunding police, but when it comes to reform though, what works?
Well, I do believe if you have, well, first and foremost, going back to borrowing Representative Quaid's, point of getting to the core issue. So when we're talking about reform, I believe you really have to start this reform, and you can probably start from a variety of areas, but what I would say is, in higher education right now, how do we educate students as they come through the system about implicit bias? How do we educate students in our curriculum about a holistic approach of looking at race and discussing that construct? So I think we have to look at first, looking at our curriculum at higher ed. I know here at M-State and in my day job as the diversity and equity and inclusion person, we are having those conversations within at least our school. I've listened to Angela Davis's NPR where there was a person at Minnesota State and Mankato. They're also having that. So I think you would start there. Then as far as the culture is concerned within the police departments, then we're looking at analyzing, again, what are we looking at internally with the policies and the practices? So I think that reform has to begin internally first. Now, if we're looking at externally, what does that look like? I mean, again, if we're looking at, because I think right now people are looking at putting together citizen oversight groups and looking at that external accountability. And I think, there's something to be said about that if, and again, this is if you get the right individuals that are looking at the best interests of both their community, but also in looking at law enforcement and how law enforcement operates in their respective communities. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds about what that accountability looks like, because then you got other things like the post board and licensing. So I mean, it's not as clear cut to answer that question about what does reform look like.
Right.
But I can tell you there is a balance between, you know, what you need to do internally and also what you need to do externally.
Well, we will definitely get into into some more details about that, because I think it's important in this discussion that we're having. But I also want to make sure, you know, that when we talk about, again, the reform angle, because there have been so many things that have been tried over the years. I've covered many of them, particularly in the city of Minneapolis, whether it was revamping their civilian oversight, the implementation of body cameras, training in impartial policing, restorative justice or procedural justice, all these different things. And we keep coming back to these impasses where the community is saying, look, there needs to be more done. And that also comes down to how police officers who do violate policies, who use excessive force, who have continued complaints against them year after year, they feel like there should be some accountability there. And so, Booker, I want to get to you as somebody who's worn the badge again, to how is the best way can police departments, do police chiefs and police leaders have the resources or the authority that they need to properly discipline these officers who are the ones that community members are pushing against?
No, I think our arbitration system here in Minnesota is one. I mean, people can go Google Minnesota Bureau of Mediation Services, and they can go look at a lot of the arbitration decisions that have come out, and you can see that we don't, by and large. The officers may disagree with that, but no, I don't think we do. But I do want to go back to what does this reform part look like? And I think one piece that, you know, I was a part of the federal mediation agreement with the Minneapolis Police Department in 2002, starting in 2002, and in 2005. I was born and raised in North Minneapolis, spent my whole life there. The one aspect that we never talk about, and in my opinion, why none of these reforms are really going to work, unless we start focusing on society. Law enforcement, society is the foundation of law enforcement. We don't make RoboCop. We don't make him or her yet. Society is the foundation of law enforcement. I'm going to give you an example of why I say this. When the incident in Sanford, Florida first happened with Trayvon Martin, and you know, it didn't really involve law enforcement, but law enforcement got tied into it, and all of a sudden you really started to see this us versus them. Society formed Black Lives Matter, police start doing thin blue line and all these other symbols that earlier in my career, I never seen a thin blue line flag, and I started in 2005. I never seen that. And now they might have existed, but I didn't see them until after Michael Brown. So society does one thing, law enforcement does the other. Law enforcement is a reflection of society. And I think until we really start to focus on society, which is the foundation of policing, none of these reforms are really going to take hold. It's just my opinion.
Right. I want to get into more about some of the barriers, perhaps, to reform that people are also criticizing police unions for. I'm going to get to that in a second, but first I'm just going to do a little radio business, just going to do a little reset. If you're just tuning in, I'm Brandt Williams. I'm talking with my guests about the future of policing. Booker Hodges is an assistant commissioner at the Department of Public Safety. Jonathan Judd is the mayor of Moorhead, and Erin May Quaid is a former legislator, and she's also an activist and the advocacy director at Gender Justice. We've had several folks who have either called in or have submitted questions about police unions. I want to go to, we have an audio cut as well. This is an audio cut from Sheldon in St. Louis Park, who has this question about police unions.
Hi, my name is Sheldon. I live in St. Louis Park. My question's about the police unions. They're a big part of the reason the department has lost the community's trust. So how do we change them?
And Mayor Judd, I mean, you as an executive, I understand you likely are involved in the talks with unions about labor contracts and that sort of thing. First, how do you weigh in on that? What we just heard?
I will tell you, honestly, we have a manager form of government here, so I don't actually get involved in the union contracts. But what I can tell you is that those are the questions, and I think that they're valid questions. I know I have constituents that are asking me, in certain circles, how is it that an officer can have conduct, at least from what they're reading in the media, and still be able to have a job or be hired in other departments. And for that, I don't know how the police union works. I do know how collective bargaining agreements work, obviously, but I honestly can't answer that question. If there are situations where officers have conduct that might be questionable, all I really can answer is that obviously there's due process that has to be followed.
Right. Well, in Moorhead, is it the city manager then who has that authority then as far as overseeing the police department, or is it the chief?
It's well, the chief oversees the police department, but when it comes to making the collective bargaining agreements per se, then that is up to the city manager. Yeah.
Right. Booker, what about you? Do you think police unions do have perhaps too much influence in the culture of police departments that can make resistant to the types of changes that people have been clamoring for as far as how police relate to the community?
So I think law enforcement unions do have a significant amount of influence on how culture is in organizations. But I think people have to realize that the union's job by law is to defend their members. And it's not just law enforcement unions we're talking about. Again, I want to encourage people to go to the Minnesota Bureau of Mediation website and click on awards. And you can see that not only just law enforcement unions, but teachers unions, transit unions, a whole host of other unions have problems getting rid of problem employees. And the other piece that I think people should really understand when you're talking about unions, go look and see who signs those union contracts, right? An arbitrator, if, say, for example, somebody wanted to go to arbitration over a union contract, an arbitrator is not going to change the language in a contract, right? That has to be negotiated. Arbitrators primarily in contracts will deal with wages. But if you go back and look at your union contracts, I guarantee you a lot of those languages, or a lot of the language in those contracts, specifically for law enforcement and other unions also, has been in there for years. And elected officials, year after year after year, continue to sign those contracts. And I think that people have to understand that the contracts are signed and negotiated by and large by the elected bodies in these municipalities.
Right. So you're saying like members of the Minneapolis City Council, they have also that type of authority to push for changes within the contract. It's not just the chief or the union president. There's another side to this.
Yes, there absolutely is. And sometimes, depending on the municipality, sometimes the chief law enforcement officer isn't engaged in the contract. I mean, sometimes there's things that the elected body or the appointed body that wants to negotiate the contract will put things in the contract without the chief, or they will negotiate directly with the union, because the union contracts belong to the specific union. It doesn't belong to the city. It doesn't even belong to the officers. It belongs to the union. And I think a lot of people really should understand how unions work. And it's not just law enforcement, again, it's other entities.
Aaron, I'd like you to weigh in as well. Do you think police unions have too much power in setting culture that can resist change in the department?
I mean, I think, one of the biggest pieces that I want to re-inject into this conversation is that when we talk about whether it's like, is it the police union that's the problem? And like, who has too much power? And what is really the reason why this isn't going well? And I think it's important to recenter our focus on the fact that currently the police system is doing what it was designed to do. The police system, as we know it now in the United States of America, was designed to keep Black people enslaved or return them to plantations if they escaped. After emancipation, it was to keep them in certain parts of a city or certain part of a state. It was to be the enforcement tool of Jim Crow era laws and segregation and racist policies. And so, like, the police union is a whole piece. Police have been used to do union busting. So I never want us to get into a conversation where we're just like maligning all unions. But I really do think that when we talk about what might be the problem with the police system and we start talking about the union, we have conceded the point that the police system was meant to do something different than what it is doing, and it was not. And that is why rebuilding something different that does what we want it to do is the aim for so many folks, because good people in a bad system is still a bad system. Reforming a bad system is still a bad system. Taking the union out of a bad system still leaves us with a bad system. And so it's not a question of like, are people good or are they bad? And I think Assistant Commissioner Hodges is 100% correct. You know, police are people who live in society. And so we will see society's beliefs reflected in the way that people are policed. But the ultimate question is, does the police system work? The answer is no. And why? It is because what we built it to do, we no longer want to do those things. And so what can we build instead? And I think that is really the questions we need to start asking and answering in order to have more productive conversations.
Thanks for bringing that back to, you know, our basic question as far as the future of policing. As you mentioned, if the whole system is designed to uphold a structure that we want to see abolished, shouldn't we abolish the system that is, or abolish that particular arm of the system, which is keeping people in the position that it is? And I've been hearing that refrain from, again, during a lot of the protests that I've been covering, not only just this year, but through the past couple decades that I've been covering the city of Minneapolis. Booker, though, when you hear, again, and you've been at the NAACP, you come from North Minneapolis, where you've seen police operating in ways, just reading some of your background here, you've seen the bad side of policing. When we're trying to, if the question is rebuilding something from the ground up, is that something that you see is possible, is doable, or is worthy?
I do think it's worthy, and I do think it's doable. I think my personal belief is the rhetoric that's going on now is not productive. I think if people actually sat down and had a meaningful conversation and really hammered out some things, I think we could get stuff done. But the us versus them has never accomplished anything, and it never will. And I get people are passionate and emotional on both sides. I've seen terrible policing growing up in North Minneapolis. I've also seen some of the most phenomenal policing ever, in my career. But I do believe if we can, as a society, can put away some of the rhetoric and really sit down and have meaningful conversations. We don't always have to agree, but the one thing my dad always told me, he told me not to yell at people. And he said, the one reason why you don't yell at people is the only thing that they're going to remember is you yelled at them. They won't remember what you say. And that goes to both sides.
Right.
Brandt, do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead, Mayor Judd. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I though Assistant Commissioner Hodges and I just met, I can tell you that just by hearing him speak, I mean, my reality, I grew up in a housing project in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so I, much like him, have seen, what I would now look back and say, bad policing versus good policing. But we can live a multitude of truths. I mean, we can say that, yes, I've seen both sides. And yes, I do believe that you can fix, if you will, the system from within the institution. But and I agree with that. I mean, I've seen good policing in my own community, and that is a truth that I'm going to stand by. And as a public defender, because I've been on a public defender as well as a prosecutor, and I can definitely say, yes, in my share of thousands of cases that I've seen, have I seen good and bad there? Absolutely. But right. I do I do agree that it does come down to sitting down at the table, having dialogue that is constructive. And what does that look like is going to probably vary based on your community and your experience.
Right. You know, I want to include again some more comments from some of the folks who tuned in here with during our Zoom meeting, and there's several questions here or comments that are in a similar vein. So I'm just going to read a couple of these, and then we can respond after these. There are folks who have asked. Beth asks, what can be done to train officers to not pull out their guns so quickly when interacting with the public? Trevor asks, let's see, can we have tier 1 and tier 2 officers, the former trained in mental health and peaceful intervention, the latter reserved only for potentially violent criminal activity? Does that work, or do situations escalate too fluidly to have different types of officers respond to different calls? Damara asks, I wonder if we can discuss, no, I'm sorry, this was a different question. My screen is moving here and it's making my eyes go up and down. But there was other questions, concerns about the militarization of police. And can we do something about the types of equipment and training officers are given that pits them in a way against members of the community, seeing them as enemies and you know, members of an occupied community instead of citizens. So these are all different types of questions that people are asking. I don't know who would like to start with that. Anything resonate with any of you? Jump right in.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to say, and I deeply respect the experience of my co-panelists, but you know, yes, we have to sit at tables. Yes, we need to have conversations, and I want to just give voice to the fact that for a lot of folks in communities, and I want to say that I am not one of these people. I experience light skin privilege. I am a suburban woman who, you know, appears unthreatening and feminine. And so I just want to name that. But for folks who live in fear in their communities of going through what happened to Mr. Floyd or Mr. Blake or Breonna Taylor in their own homes, Botham Jean, Walter Scott, Tamir Rice, like the list goes on. It is really hard to ask people to experience oppression quietly and to respond to that oppression and state enacted violence in a way that that is unreasonable, right? State violence is upsetting and it requires us to react as if we are upset about it happening. And it's not really a both sides issue to me, because ultimately the police system and the people in it are representation of our state, right? And so that requires a different level of discipline when interacting with citizens. But all that to say, with the tier 1, tier 2, you know, I will say that we've seen replicated over and over again, the racial disparities that exist in society get replicated through things like trying to parse out. So when in Minneapolis, they were giving out coupons to fix broken taillights, it was going predominantly to white motorists who were getting pulled over and not people of color. And so what is considered a threatening crime versus a mental health crisis will likely be determined based on the color of your skin and how big you are and your gender identity presentation. So I think that is a little bit of a thing that gets into what sounds like a good reform, but a great way for us to just replicate the racial disparities and the biases that exist within society through a police system. And I forgot the other 2 questions, but I'll let my panelists respond before I get into them.
Yeah, Booker Hodges, Jonathan Judd, both jump in. Anything else that sparked something with you?
Well, I'm going to talk about the militarization of police, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to explain to the citizens that, or just a friendly reminder that in the United States, within the continental United States, we have decided as a society long ago that we don't want the military performing functions on American soil. And because we've decided that, we've given that power over to police. If you go to other countries around the world, you will see military members standing in the street with AK-47s and tanks and whatnot. We don't have that here. We've decided to give that function over to police. This country has multiple weapons for every single person in the country. So law enforcement officers, their duty and what they want to do is go home at the end of the night, at least physically, the same way that they came to work. So we have to protect our police officers. I understand how this looks, but I think people need to be reminded that we've given the power to police that we don't have for the military to come into our country. And that's a delineation here in the United States that we don't often talk about. Also, the issue of training police officers. Obviously, that is something that we really have to look at. But again, I'm going to go back to the foundations of society. We need to really focus on getting good people in society to want to come be police officers. Because if we don't, and law enforcement agencies are struggling to hire people, and you're hiring people who are borderline or who might not get hired or wouldn't get hired under normal circumstances, that's not going to be good for any of us. Just like in any profession, you know, I don't want an airline pilot that that's at the bottom of the barrel. I don't want a doctor that, you know, just got by. You know, we don't want that. So we need good people to come join this profession.
Right. Mayor
But
Judd,
I would argue, Assistant Commissioner Hodges, that we do have good people. I would argue we do have good people who are law enforcement officers. I think we do have good people who are in these systems. And I think part of the problem is that we keep thinking that if there are better people in the system, we wouldn't get these outcomes, when in fact the system is designed to be this outcome regardless of who's in it.
My thoughts to Representative Quaid's point, I mean, again, how we live a variety of truths. I mean, full disclosure, I mean, my mom, I come from a single parent household. My mom was beaten. She is a domestic abuse survivor for well over a decade in my upbringing. And I saw the good and bad. I also grew up in a housing project where I have seen officers in my youth come in and what I would say commit, well, pretty much crimes of brutality against individuals living in a housing project. On the flip side, where I was going with my mother, I've also seen the compassionate side of officers where I'm a crying 8-year-old child who they're comforting, putting in the back of a squad car that's keeping me safe from an individual that's harming my family within my family. So again, I understand and I've lived those truths. And part of the reason why I became an attorney, specifically a public defender and a prosecutor, is one, to be supportive of people from those disadvantaged communities who also live those multiple truths, but also using a constructive manner in order to hold accountability to the individuals that are in uniform. So my point is that, I mean, I think as a leader, specifically a Black leader in a community that is predominantly white, we have to tell those narratives. We have to allow people to, and not necessarily remain silent, but if we're going to bring communities together to reform and make police and their departments responsive to the needs of our specific communities.
Right. Well, and I want to make sure
that.
Right. And so, and here's what I'm hearing, and just kind of put that out there. I mean, because yes, on one hand we have, Aaron, as you'd mentioned, you know, the system itself was set up in a way that has its outcome. The outcomes that we see now are more of a result of how it was set up and not as a dysfunction in that system. We're also at a point where we see that there are people in need of services that involve protection, that need somebody to intervene in a violent situation, and we're talking about ways to make this system work instead of the old way in a new way. And I want to make sure that we, you know, kind of keep putting that forward. What does that look like? Is it officers who have lived the experiences of people like Booker and Jonathan Judd? I mean, or and do we put it on those particular members of society of a police force to be the ones that say, hey, you know, the way stuff was done before is not right. I'm going to do this differently. And we've had several comments as well. People have said, look, you need to concentrate on, again, hiring people who represent the diversity of the communities that they're patrolling, and are from those areas, maybe even require them to live in those areas. So as we talk about those things, back to, you know, to the panel, what makes sense to you? What, if we're going to try to be both and about this, if possible? I mean, the policing isn't going away anytime soon, but we need to make some changes, is what I'm hearing. What do we do in the meantime? How do we do something that's effective? Is it, again, hiring these officers from these communities and in training them in certain ways? So I'm just going to put that back to you, Aaron. How do we How do we make these two things work? Or maybe we don't.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're right? Policing isn't going away anytime soon. Nothing has changed in the city of Minneapolis or most police departments across the nation since May 25th. And so what I want to say is that I don't think that the answers of like, what do we do in the meantime actually start with the police system. If we want to talk about what brings about, safety is is produced, it is an outcome of a community and a society that is invested in so that people can not just survive but thrive. So if we really want to talk about the things, and the thing is we already know, right? We have done the research. We know what things reduce violent crime, reduce rates of domestic violence, reduce rates of drug use and substance use disorder, right? So it's things like a living wage, investing in deeply affordable housing, fully funding our public schools, making sure our healthcare is not tied to our job and that it is unaffordable even if it's not, making sure that we are telling the truth about our history and investing in education, including higher education or the trades, and on and on and on. Having affirmative consent education and comprehensive sex education so that we learn about healthy relationships in our bodies. I mean, these are all things that we can do. Early childhood education and universal child care and universal family care. These are all things that we can invest in. And it's a great time to look at how we do that because we have seen that our government can respond very fast and can turn around very fast and invest in things that for too long we have been told we can't. And so I would say that what do we do in the meantime is we start with those things because we can see what the outcome of a fully invested in society is, and it is that there is more safety and there is less of a need for the type of policing that we have now. Well,
I wonder if this isn't also a matter of, it's hard to see these results work slowly. And, those programs, and I've covered this in city government, these things they take a lot of planning, they take investments, they take, and the results you may not see them for years. I mean, you put money into, certain types of early childhood, education programming or whatever it may be. Folks may not see the results for years to come, but you put more police officers on the street and you see a lot of police presence out there. And I'm just wondering if that might be one of the things that's complicating, or maybe it's making it, it's sapping the political will from folks who are making these decisions to go ahead and make the hard thing and say, look, we're going to take, this money and we're going to put it into these programs, even though you may not see the results from these until long after I'm out of office. Mayor Judd, how about you? What is that a concern that you have? I mean, if you want to put money into these things that are going to address these long-term problems, it's not sexy. It's not shiny new police cars.
Well, that's my point, Brandt, and that's where I was going earlier. I mean, the way I see it, Chief Shannon Monroe here and Sheriff Mark Empting up in Clay County, we're looking at, in essence, generally speaking, a three-pronged approach. One, education. What are we doing in our region to say we're going to look at curriculum? We're going to have a more diverse curriculum, teaching about diversity, teaching about other cultures. What are we doing to, when the 18-year-old comes on campus, what are we doing to broaden that individual's horizons in our curriculum as it pertains to law enforcement? Number two, internally, when we look at our local police departments, what are we doing internally to hold individuals accountability and creating a inclusive and welcoming environment? So to Assistant Commissioner Hodges' point, what are we doing internally to make it a more inclusive and welcoming environment for those students to come in and be able to be successful? Can we grow our own? What are we doing within our communities to keep those individuals who want to work in law in enforcement? What are we doing to make sure that they have access? Are we doing scholarships? Are we doing community programs to grow our own, moving them into law enforcement, grooming those individuals to be leaders? And then the third component is external. There has to be that relationship building and accountability and trust. Again, trust with the people in law enforcement, with the community, so we can be responsive and know what those needs are. These are the things that, what are we doing now? What can we do in the future? We have to do these three things and be able and willing to invest. What that investment looks like is more than just money. It has to be people. It has to be having conversations like these to bring people together to make these three things work. And there has to be policies, procedures, and practices in action to back those things up.
Right. I want to kind of shift a little bit to when we talk about reforms that, that states outside of Minnesota are also working on the same issues. According to some reporting from the Marshall Project this summer, 16 legislatures in 16 states have discussed policing reforms. Recently, of course, Wisconsin's governor has called for a special session to discuss police accountability in the wake of Jacob Blake's shooting. And of course, in July, Governor Tim Walz, he signed off on a package of several policing reforms that were designed to do things like ban chokeholds and warrior-style training for officers. That's just a few of them. So I want to get a sense of when we're trying to make some of these changes, some of them are going to require law changes at the state level, not just cities like Moorhead and Minneapolis and many around the state. Aaron, I want to ask you, as far as with your experience at the legislature, is there an appetite for? I mean, we saw there was a significant amount of things that were left out of this particular package that passed. Do you think there's the political will out there to make these types of changes that will allow cities to bring about the reforms they want?
That's a good question. I was really disappointed to see some of the rhetoric that went on when the House was passing the Minnesota Police Accountability Act. In particular, the former chair of the Public Safety Committee was talking about, Brian Johnson was talking about how right now there are citizen snipers that sit in the trees that shoot police officers every day, and we don't know about it because the media won't cover it. And he was lamenting the fact that some people can't become police officers because they don't pass background checks, and that barrier is unreasonable. And those are the kinds of comments that were being made from members of the state legislature. And when you ask about the political will, there are certainly legislators who know that what we have right now is not working, that we need to change things and things need to be different. But then I think a better question is, are there people who actually believe that this is a problem? So for example, the chair of the tax committee, Roger Chamberlain, has been promoting a book by a neo-Nazi white supremacist that essentially says that there should be supreme leaders of white men, and that the reason we have racial disparities, the reason we have the racial disparities that we do, is because Black people are inferior. They're natural because we're inferior. And so political will, I mean, is there even an understanding of what is happening, why it's happening, and that it's wrong, and then we should do something about it? And that's probably the thing that concerns me more. There are certainly legislators who get it, who want to do something, but I think that there are a whole host of folks who actually think that what is happening is good and fine, and that we shouldn't change anything. We should lean more into the things that are wrong and have gotten us where we are. So I think that is going to be a really big problem. I do think that the legislature and looking at the state needs to make sure that they leave room for communities to create their own solutions. What works in Minneapolis is going to be different than what works in Moorhead. It's going to be different than what works in Apple Valley to Zumbrota. And so I think that's going to be the job for the state legislature, is to leave space for communities and to invest in communities figuring out what this looks like, because we're dismantling or trying to dismantle 400 years of a system that's not working, and it's not going to be overnight, and it's not going to be fast. And so how do we move at the speed of trust and at the speed of urgency without sacrificing good policy to do it?
Right. Okay, I'm curious about your experience. I mean, do you see that there have been some things that can be done at the state that would actually bring about some of the change that people are looking for?
Yeah, I do. And Commissioner John Harrington and Attorney General Keith Ellison did come together and did a deadly force encounters working group. And those recommendations are on the DPS website, and I would encourage people to go read those. It was a bipartisan effort. Both Democrats and Republicans, community members and law enforcement all came together and came up with these recommendations. So I would really encourage people to do that. And I do think there is an appetite for change. Now, those meetings that happened during the Deadly Force Encounters Working Group were contentious, but they were cordial. And again, I go back to, why were they cordial? Because people viewed each other as human. And at the end of the day, I don't think we get anything passed until we go back to humanizing one another. I am a person. I'm a police officer. I'm an African-American man, but I am a person. And I think until we get back to that, where we view each other as people, not by an occupation, not by a race, we're going to continue to have these conversations. So there is an appetite for it.
Well, when it comes to, again, some of these state changes, I mean, are there, I'm trying to get a sense too of, because there have been proposals that have been floated, again, like the requirements to have officers live in the cities where they work. Of course, there's state law that prevents that sort of thing. Civilian police oversight are not allowed to make disciplinary decisions involving police officers. They can only recommend, to a chief to, if they've find findings in a particular complaint. And there are many more in requiring personal or professional liability insurance for police officers. These are all things that people have said we'd like to do, but there are state barriers to that sort of thing. Of those list of things, I'm just curious if those may be helpful in changing the behaviors of police officers, of changing if the training isn't going to kick in, if we look at their behaviors and how they act, if there's more accountability that can be done, but requires the approval of state legislatures. I see Jonathan Judd, you're nodding your head there. What do you say about that?
Absolutely. I think Representative Quaid and Assistant Commissioner Hodges are right on point with this. Again, going back to what I said earlier, our officers, and I think it should be noted, when I talked to Police Chief Monroe 10 years ago, we were, and I don't know if this is an average or just 1 year, but we had 33 complaints in the Moorhead Police Department. I think it was over a decade ago. And maybe that's either, again, a year or an average. But my understanding in talking with him, we're now down to 3 to 4 a year. And what my understanding is that we have a large amount of officers that voluntarily live within our city or within a few miles away. And again, to Commissioner Hodges' point, where being human and humanizing, when you see these individuals locally frequenting your businesses, actively involved in schools, actively involved in volunteer organizations, being a part and immersed in the community, it's going to take a while. But I think you're going to see that humanizing aspect where, oh, wait, that's Officer so-and-so, but they're not in uniform. They're laughing, they're smiling, they're with their children, they're with their families. And I mean, that's going to take time. And if we need, and again, I don't want to overstep any bounds here, but if you had the flexibility to at least have a local entity make a decision as to whether or not their officers should live in their own communities, at least give that flexibility for an individual department to make that call.
Booker, I want to put something to you as well. There was a discussion that we spoke to members of the Minneapolis Police Federation, their executive board, several months ago. And there was a board member who expressed concern about, if living in Minneapolis and having to encounter someone while they're in a grocery store with their child, they're I don't want to misquote her, but she didn't want her child to be exposed to one of the people that she had interacted with and had to arrest. And so, again, as somebody who's been in uniform, I mean, is this something that is realistic? I mean, as a police officer, were you ever concerned that when you were out and about making a run at Costco or something like that, that you were going to see somebody who you arrested a couple days before?
Well, I always have this conversation in law enforcement, and I'm just going to be honest, a lot of cops don't agree with me, but I do firmly believe you should live where you work, and I have. I'm the school resource officer. My wife is the head guidance counselor in our neighborhood. So we can't go nowhere without people knowing who we are. And I think you should live where you work. I think it's really beneficial for doing that. Again, it's the humanization factor. Do I think that right now we should force cops who don't live in where they work to go move? No, I don't. But I think, it's something to look at moving forward. It's just, yeah, you see those people, and I get that concern. But, having been a school resource officer, the kids know me, whether, I'm outside of uniform or whatnot. working narcotics, those people knew me, whether I was inside a uniform or not, whereas the average street cop, most people aren't going to recognize you outside a uniform, right? But I do firmly believe that we should live where you work, or at least close.
Right. I also want to get to some questions that we have about funding for police officers, for police departments. And I want to kind of include that into a broader discussion about, as we look forward into the future, and given the economic downturn that we're experiencing in this state and other states due to the pandemic and other issues, that cities are going to have to make their own cuts, their own decisions about the size of their police forces, or if they should be able to have a police force at all. There have been a lot of smaller communities around the state that have had to either dissolve their policing organizations and contract with the counties and other cities. So I'll start by just kind of putting that out there, as well as if Mayor Judd, maybe to you, is this something that we can expect to see in the future, and how does that contribute to the issues? I mean, is that a way of alleviating some of the issues, or could this make it worse if you're contracting with a law enforcement department where those officers don't have much experience in your community?
There are pros and cons to that, and we're experiencing that. One of the other hats that I wear is I teach Minnesota criminal law and procedure at Minnesota State University Moorhead, and I've been doing that now for approximately 6 years. And when I first started, we used to have 15 to 18 students in our class. I'm lucky now. I think I just went back over double digits last year. And so, and most of those folks, they're going into other segments, maybe like DNR or federal. But I do see that there is a situation where it could be, if we don't get more numbers of folks that are willing to live and work in greater Minnesota, that could be an issue for our departments here locally in Clay County and Moorhead, but also throughout greater Minnesota. I just don't know in the future what that will look like from a budget standpoint, but it would be devastating for our jurisdiction if we had to do something like that.
Right. And Aaron, there's other concerns that we've been hearing from some of the folks who have participating in our conversation through Zoom, that it seems like police departments do use a lot of the funding, discretionary funding, general funds in city governments. And I'm just wondering if, when we address the issue of defunding, if we should be extra mindful of again, the pot of money that's there, how much is going to policing and how much is going to these other services that cities and municipalities provide. I'm curious about where you stand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest piece that sticks out to me is we can't just keep leaving municipalities and cities out on their own to figure out how to serve the residents of their city and the constituents that live there. And so I think about, Mayor Judd's community, and if we don't get serious about how we are going to, the tax base in certain parts of the state, right? It could be way fewer people with a lot more land. It could be just fewer people because fewer people live there. And folks in those communities don't deserve less things because they live near fewer people, or people in certain communities don't deserve less things because people in that community make less money than people in other communities. And I say all that to say that, we are in an economic downturn. We are in a recession, possibly a depression. Our economy is contracting. There are a lot of people who are making money and more money. And so I think we need to get real about how are we going to fund the things that we need? How are we going to make sure that it happens in communities like mine and a suburban community like Apple Valley? How does it happen in Minneapolis? And how does it happen in rural Minnesota, a community like Moorhead, Minnesota? And so I think we need to get serious about what we're going to fund. And I think we need to get serious about looking at the things that we want to fund before we start saying, okay, we need to send in armed people to deal with this thing. Because ultimately, again, the police system was meant to keep certain people in certain places and then protect property. And so if that's a major concern, we can do that in different ways. So I think we need to get real about how we're actually going to fund things and not leave municipalities on their own to try to cover budget deficits and then use police to, police people who are experiencing crises.
You know, I want to start getting some, wrapping our conversation and get some final thoughts from each of you, just to kind of sum up some of the things that we've been talking about today. And if there's anything else you think is still important to emphasize or add to the conversation. Booker, I'll start with you. Some final thoughts from you.
First, again, I want to thank NPR, Representative Quaid, and Mayor Judd, too, for being on this panel, and you for hosting. I just want to close with, I think as society now, we really have to focus on humanizing one another. We're all people. We might not agree on everything, but we have to start humanizing one another and start respecting one another and having meaningful, respectful dialogue if we're going to ever come through any of these issues. Is law enforcement perfect? No. Society is not perfect. I'm not perfect. None of us are perfect. And it's time for us really to come together and solve these issues. I'm 43 years old. My dad told me the same stuff. He was experiencing the same stuff when he was in his teens, and we're still having these same conversations. We keep applying the same approach. It's not working. So let's really come together as a society. Law enforcement, to me, I still believe is the most noble profession on the face of the earth. Do we always get it right? No. Are we in a perfect system? Absolutely not. But it's time for us to come together as a society and really focus and value on each other's humanity. So thanks again.
Thanks, Booker. Mayor Judd, some final thoughts from you.
Again, I would echo Assistant Commissioner Booker, Hodges. Thank you for having me on here. I'm blessed to be invited here. And also thank you to Representative Quaid for coming on board as well. I think for me, the thing I want to highlight is when we have these conversations, and the reason why I shared my personal story earlier is because I want folks to know that the elected leaders who are making these decisions, I would like to believe we're not all operating in a vacuum or in silos. I understand the realities of African Americans, Black and brown folks, Indigenous folks, and their experiences with law enforcement and as society as a whole. I've lived that. But I think as leaders, we have a really tough task right now. And I think part of my obligation, because I know law enforcement officers and their families locally and within my own family, we're really trying to do the best that we can to make sure that people are valued and, to Assistant Commissioner Hodges' point, humanized. We know that there's going to be folks that are not operating the way that they should. And we know that there are institutions within our society that are in the same boat. But I think we really need to focus on constructive dialogue moving forward and not knee-jerk responses to problem solving, because that, in essence, a history of doing it is why we're sitting here today. Right. Is a systematic, history of knee-jerk responses, quick fixes, and the problem is still there. So I, again, just would ask folks when they're watching and listening to really process this conversation, and let's be solutions oriented, and let's try to bring us all together to continue this conversation and spearhead it into action.
All right, thanks, Mayor Judd. Erin, Representative Quaid, some final thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to speak to the pain that I think a lot of people are feeling. And it's people who have experienced violence from the state, from police. It's people who are in law enforcement. And we find ourselves feeling at a loss. And it seems like we keep having these generational conversations. We keep trying to figure out what do we do to move forward. And I want to just call to folks to feel deep down that we know what we need to do. In the United States, we built systems at its founding that was meant to eradicate the people who lived on this land beforehand, enslave an entire population of people to build the wealth and economy of this country. And we are reckoning with that right now. And it means that when we look at the system that we have and we ask ourselves, is this working? Not are the people good, not are the people doing the right thing or the wrong thing, but is the system working? And what was it designed to do? And do we want it to still do that? And the answer is resoundingly no. And I place myself in the long history of our country. You know, abolition was a very radical idea when we abolished slavery. Folks weren't sure what we were going to do, and we did figure it out. And part of the way that dehumanization and the anti-Blackness that exists in our society is to say that Black and brown people are not fully human. And when you watch that video of Mr. Floyd being murdered with a knee on the neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and that blank look on the face, that is what anti-Blackness looks like, the inability to recognize Black people as human. And until we stop upholding systems and trying to tinker with systems that are built around that premise, we're going to feel that loss and that pain, because we're ultimately moving in a direction of upholding white supremacy and reforming it to try to move to liberation. And that's never going to feel right. So I urge people to continue to do the work, know that there are no quick fixes. Moving really fast at the expense of doing it right is a characteristic of white supremacy culture in and of itself. But we can center the folks most impacted, we can hear the calls, and because we built these systems, because humans built these systems, it means we are the most qualified to rebuild something different that does what we want it to do. And I actually think the people of Minnesota are the people who can do that. Thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank Assistant Commissioner Hodges and Mayor Judd for being on this panel with me and sharing their expertise and their experiences.
Sure, and thank you, and thanks again for everybody who tuned in. This has been a great discussion. Obviously, we're going to keep going with our coverage in the weeks and months to come here on NPR News. Again, we heard from Booker Hodges. He's an assistant commissioner at the Department of Safety. Jonathan Judd is the mayor of Moorhead, and we also heard from Erin May Quaid. She's a former legislator. Thank you all again, and this is Brandt Williams, and you've been listening to NPR News.